affectionate, touching. So essentially, we just need to sit back and get into a few scuffles here and there before swooping in and taking the throne. Arthur summarized and got a nod from Renner, who he then gave a peck on the cheek. You know, some would say you're shoving your relationship into our faces with such obvious acts of affection. Brain spoke, and Arthur simply shrugged at his words. Although they were true to some extent, sometimes you just gotta show off. Edstrom, if you don't mind, could you bring me something to wear? Of course, Your Highness, also you don't have to worry about the office getting clean up, we already tasked some maids to do that. Edstrom explained, and Brain once again gave the couple a thumbs up. Arthur simply nodded in acknowledgement. Renner gave her thanks to Edstrom before both the maid and the martial artist excused themselves, exiting the room. It seems like we have some time on our hands, he said while using his arm to fondle her breast. The feeling of its fleshy smoothness was something else, like a water balloon filled with thick liquid rather than water. Renner laid her head on his chest, letting out muffled moans and enjoyed the fondling of her breast. While both probably wanted to have sex right now, she was still sore and she needed at least a few hours, plus Arthur's dick was also a bit sore. You know, I might not be able to walk properly today, she said, looking up at him, her beautiful turquoise eyes shining as the light refracted on them, their crystalline look adding to the cute features of her face. Arthur kissed her on the forehead with gentle affection before he calmly responded to her words. I suppose that means I did my job, right? What is a man if he can't please his woman? He said as he grabbed her chin and used his hand to carefully direct her head to look up, allowing him to give her a kiss on the lips before kissing the side of her neck, then her ear before finally kissing the back of her neck. Renner couldn't help but silently relish the moment. His affectionate kisses made her feel a different type of way. It made her insides tingle. It was as it should be, her lover lovingly kissing her almost as if he can't get enough of her body. If your job was to cripple me, then I suppose you did it right, although how exactly am I supposed to do other things that require my legs? She asked jokingly, letting her body lean further onto his body, to sell the idea of being crippled. Quite the dilemma, isn't it? Well, you're in luck. Your knight in shining armor is available 24/7, and he shall be your legs, he said as their hands locked together, her delicate small and feminine hand intertwining affectionately with his masculine and larger hand. You can't do everything for me, my knight. Oh, I assure you, I can, he informed as he brought their hands close to his face and gave her hand a quick peck on the back of her hand, his action only causing Renner to feel a deeper sense of affection for him. Renner couldn't help but think back on her life, prior to before she met Arthur. Before him she was stuck in a situation that did her no favors. She had managed to get her way when it came to when she will be married, despite that she would still end up being a tool used for political purposes. If Barbaro had taken the throne, no doubt he would have sold her off to whatever noble was offering support to the crown, if not that then he probably would have her killed to get rid of any threat to his rule. Zanak as king would have been better for her, however he too would use her as a bargaining chip at some point. Such was the nature of being a princess. Though you may live it, your life isn't yours. But all of that didn't happen, and now she has things that she wouldn't have gotten without Arthur. She had never thought of being a ruler, yet with Arthur she was able to make that a goal to work towards. It may not be an original dream, but it is something that she currently wants and probably wouldn't have wanted without Arthur's presence. She can certainly do better than both her father or brothers at being a ruler. Speaking of being a ruler, she turned her body and faced him. She gave him a kiss on his lips before looking him in the eyes. About you and I being king and queen, she began. They hadn't properly spoken about it. Aside from the one time where they revealed what they wanted, they've never had a proper talk about who's going to do what. Yes, about that. Arthur had his own thoughts on the matter. While he does want to sit on the throne of the king, there are things to consider, like that fact he's a foreigner and such. For the most part, the nobles are traditionalists. Despite you being a foreigner, they'll still favor you as the ruler. After all, no woman has ever been a ruler before, she explained, her hands delicately caressing his face. I don't particularly have a problem with you as the ruler, as without you I wouldn't even have the opportunity to sit on the throne. However, I also don't want to be sidelined. This is my kingdom too, it's my home, she said with resoluteness in her voice, her hands squishing his cheeks, and Arthur couldn't help but stifle an amused chuckle. He grabbed her hand and spoke. That's true. Besides, I wasn't planning on just being the one who rules. both of us need to be rulers sharing equal power of the throne. I say this because it would be unfair on you not to, and because I highly doubt everyone would be okay with just me at the seat, so we'll be sharing the power and establish a new ruling system. He informed. Arthur didn't particularly believe ruling a nation was a single-person job, plus Renner was quite smart. He needed someone like her as a second head. It's better to have someone of equal power to you, second-guessing you and you to second-guess them in order for a proper decision to be made. That's what I was thinking as well. I believe that the citizens will be more pleased with that form of rule, even if the nobles object to it. As long as the citizens don't, it will work. She concurred, and Arthur kissed her softly, tasting her lips once more. His arms felt her body as he held her close, feeling her warmth. The fact that she belonged to him was unchanged, although there was another that he needed to claim. A.N. Thoughts on chapter? Was the affection too much or just right? It's exam time for me, so no chapter for a bit, maybe till like the 7/8, maybe we'll see if it. I get a break. 7 comments 0 vote. Lycius. A day later. Lycius walked through the halls of the mansion that belonged to a generous noble that Renner had managed to somehow convince to not only house them but also have the noble leave his own residence. Lycius doesn't know how she did it, but she figured with how corrupt the nobles were, a little blackmail goes a long way. Of course the adventurer's mind wasn't clouded by such trivial things, instead she was plagued by guilt that no visits to the temple could absolve her of. As she walked, her steps careful and steady, but her gait unsure and anxious, she couldn't help but think about Arthur. When she had first heard that he was participating in the war against Baharuth, she was sure he would come back, so she did not worry about him. However, she did regret not speaking to him before he left. Her brows creased as the feeling of guilt churned in her stomach. What did she need to speak to him for? She wasn't his lover, only a friend, so there was no need to send him off. Despite thinking that she still couldn't help but regret that she hadn't spoken to him, what if he had died? What would she have done? Fortunately he did come back, although that did make her a bit mad that she had to hear about that from Edstrom and he did not say it to her himself. No. She denied, once again reminding herself that she and him were not lovers. He owed her no explanation, yet despite her thoughts, her heart felt a slight anger at him. She wanted to send him off and welcome him back. Her emotions were contradicting each other at every turn. She wanted to deny her feelings for him, yet at the same time she couldn't help but want him at the same time, and that is where her guilt comes from. How could she pine for a man that already belonged to her friend, especially since Renner had even asked her if she had feelings for Arthur and she denied, so she had no right to go back and tell her that she now had feelings for Arthur. Her steps halted. She had wanted to confess to Renner, tell her about her feelings, tell her that she wants Arthur to hold her gently like a delicate maiden, to kiss her softly with affection and love. She wanted to sleep in his bed and do lewd things like hand-holding. Her face blushed at the thought. She shook her head, clearing her thoughts. She was a holy maiden, she can't be having such indecent thoughts. But still. She whispered to herself, regardless of whether she was a holy maiden or not, her feelings were her feelings and she recognizes that she can't keep them bottled up forever, plus they'll be a distraction. There's a civil war going on and she can't be distracted at such a critical time. I should have discussed this with Evely. She said. The magic caster had seen that there was a problem and asked about it, but Lycius simply said nothing to her, and now here she was completely unsure of what to do. Not telling Renner about her feelings for Arthur would be a betrayal. How can she keep something like this from the princess, but at the same time, telling her may end the friendship and potentially ruin Arthur's relationship with Renner? It also didn't help that she was unsure if Arthur even liked her back. She does recall that time in the carriage back from Carne Village. He said he could be more than a friend, so maybe he's interested in her. Evely even scolded Arthur for flirting. This is difficult. She told herself as she leaned on her back against the wall. It made zero sense. She's faced countless monsters in battle, yet for some reason she's afraid of telling the truth. What's difficult? Her body jolted up in surprise as she recognized the voice that asked. She turned and their eyes met. His emerald eyes shone with the brilliance of a shining crystal, his face handsome. He displayed a smile that caused a blush to appear on her face as she quickly denied everything. Nothing's difficult. I didn't say anything, she said whilst looking away at him, and she heard him softly chuckle at her words. Don't worry, Lycius, it's just me, you can relax, he said, stepping forward. He figured she must have been being her chunny self and role-playing, plus she had her back against the wall and was probably pretending to be some cool brooding character. Anyway, I've been meaning to see you, he said, his voice tickling her ears in a pleasant way, and she wanted to respond but couldn't as her words got stuck in her throat, so she only gave him a sideways nod. You've always been cute, when blushing, he said as he grabbed her hand and pulled her close, and she wanted to resist but found herself giving in and letting it happen. Her body was not doing as he wanted. Don't say that, she said weakly, almost as if she didn't believe her own admonish words. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and small feelings of elation bubbled within the pits of her stomach. She did not want to be happy about his words. After all, being called cute doesn't mean anything, but she couldn't help it. Her face flushed a clearer shade of pink. Why not? It's true. It was here that Arthur began to feel like a piece of shit. Barely a day ago, he had made his relationship with Renner, and a few hours ago he managed to make it hard for her to walk again, but here he was trying to get another woman. It was greedy, it was selfish, and it was thoughtless. He knew that, but he couldn't help. No, that would be a lie. It's not that he couldn't help himself, he wanted this and he didn't want to stop. The only regret was that he wasn't honest with Renner from the start. What about Renner? She asked while her head was still turned away. Arthur grabbed her chin and turned her head towards him, and Lycius offered no resistance. They once again locked eyes, and her stomach fluttered as they were now closer than before. Lycius, don't worry, we'll talk to Renner and explain, I'm sure she'll understand. He rubbed his thumb over her pink lips and she looked at him with the longing eyes of a maiden in love. Wow, I can't believe I'm doing this, he thought to himself, feeling the pit of his stomach churned. He hated NTR by all accounts. It didn't matter if it Nettori or whatever, they were all the same thing, so he isn't going to cheat on Renner by kissing Lycius, no matter how much he wants to. She will? She asked, not really doubting his words but simply looking for reassurance. It would be so much easier if Renner simply did understand and didn't make a fuss over this. Yes, let's just go tell her, he said, and she tried to pull her hand away from his grasp, hesitating to let Renner know about this. However, she decided to go through with it. It was obvious that Arthur liked her too, they just had to explain it to Renner, and she would understand, right? Certainly, the princess was a reasonable and logical individual. Surely she would allow her lover to have another woman. Lycius wasn't being delusional for hoping this to be true. Arthur, on the other hand, couldn't help but be nervous. He had done nothing to curb Renner Yandere potential. As such, this has a chance of going sideways pretty fast, and he was quite certain the typical excuse of, I can't handle him alone, in the bed, wouldn't work. It's fine, she's smart, she won't do anything unreasonable, and I just have to control the situation so things don't get out of hand, he thought, trying to convince himself as he held her hand and walked towards the room Renner would be located in. A little shorter than usual, sorry about that. Also, does this feel a bit rushed? It feels bit rushed to me. Also, I'm like 5 chapters ahead in Patreon, and this will be ending in like 3 to 4 chapters, so you guys have 8 to 9 chapters left. Also, I'm ending this FIC mostly because I'm tired and bored of this FIC, and I don't want to go on a hiatus and then just never come back giving you guys false hope. So that means even though it's ending, there might be some updates every few months or so, depending if I'm in the mood to write it. But once this is over, I have 2 fanfic you can check out, one being Invincible, Osmosion, and the other a different Musen, Demon Slayer Modern. Oh, it's Demon Slayer set in the modern day. 6 comments, 0 vote. Well, shit. Renner sat on her chair, her ass cushioned by a soft pillow that made seating a bit more comfortable for her. Arthur was certainly a beast in bed and made his mission to thoroughly enjoy himself and made sure to satisfy her in return. This was all fine. In fact, she loved it, and wanted him to have sex with her as frequent as they possibly can, regardless if it meant that it would be difficult for her to sit down afterwards. Even right now, despite her vagina aching and her buttocks being sore from being spanked, her mind and heart yearned for more. Her heart felt a pang as she remembered, and she smiled. She definitely needed more of him in her. She quickly shook her head, ridding herself of such unholy thoughts. This wasn't the time to be distracted. There was a civil war going on and she needed to focus. Since she was now the leader of the Goldilocks organization, a newly formed company that both helps in the transportation of goods and weapons and as well as medicines and potions, this meant that she had some spies to work with, since Goldilocks used to be 8 fingers and they had plenty of assassins and spies. This meant it wasn't just Edstrom collecting information. The dancing scimitar was only appointed to collect information from the castle where Barbara was living, while all others collected information on the rest of the nobles and her father, which was why she was reading a report about how the nobles had somehow convinced her father to have a meeting with Barbara. Either it's betrayal or the nobles want Nazzarick to take my father's place when he returns from Baharuth. She surmised. While the nobles of the royalty faction were loyal to the royal family, that didn't mean they had to be loyal to the king when there were better options. This works better for me and Arthur, she whispered to herself as she placed the piece of paper she was holding on the desk. It still made her blush when she realized that this was the desk Arthur took her for the first time, which was only 2 days ago. The doors clicked open and Arthur walked, with Lycius walking behind him. She was about to speak but quickly noticed that the two were holding hands. The princess kept her composure. There was nothing to be worried about, the two were quite close, so it shouldn't be unusual to hold hands. However, Lycius, looking down and instead of looking up, gave hints of something the princess did not like. Darling, I thought you said you were going to spar, why are you back already? She said, purposely adding the word, darling, to test something, and Lycius flinched as she heard the word, and that was all Renner needed. The princess could feel her rage beginning to form at the pits of her stomach. Surely not. Renner, I want to discuss something with you, and I do hope we can all keep our cool heads once we begin. Arthur began. He already knew the situation was a bit unpleasant and that Renner certainly had the potential to launch herself at Lycius screaming bloody murder. Renner was usually a rational person, however Arthur knew when it came to emotions things tend to go sideways. Arthur, darling. I am always level-headed, so there's no need for such warnings. She said, once again emphasizing the word darling and once again causing Lycius to squirm in discomfort, noticing that Renner had the intense urge to hurl slurs at the blonde-haired adventurer, but she kept her composure. You filthy bitch. How dare you do this to me? I'll kill you. The princess thought but didn't vocalize. The vibrant light blue color of her beautiful eyes dimmed, becoming darker, and her face gained a neutral expression. I think I should go. This was a mistake. Oh no, my dear friend, stay. I need to hear why you would betray me like this. I didn't mean to. Ah yes, of course you didn't mean to. Obviously that makes things better and I can forgive you, right? Did you lie to me back then? Am I so low on your friends list that you'd betray me like this? The princess asked, her voice devoid of any emotion and her face retaining its neutral expression. Her mind was in turmoil, her anger telling her to act and rip the bitch apart, but she knew better, so she kept her calm. Renner, it's not her fault, it's mine. I'm the one who pursued and she can't be blamed, and besides it's not like this is unheard of, right? The man responsible spoke, his smooth voice cutting through the tension and grabbing their attention. He didn't plan to just be a passive observer, and he wasn't about to let Lycius go either, regardless of how she seemed to tug away her arm from his grip. Renner didn't respond. She wanted to speak, but for some reason words failed her. It was easy to insult and berate Lycius, but with Arthur she found herself hard-pressed to do so. His words did not make her feel angry like with Lycius. No, they stung to hear. She didn't want to hear them. Arthur belongs to her, so to hear him outright reject that was a blow she was not prepared for. She held herself together and spoke, asking him a question. I thought you said you loved me, was that a lie? It was not a lie. I can love both of you at the same time. Like I said, this isn't unheard of. He said, pulling Lycius close and holding her closer but making sure not to hold her waist. He wasn't trying to have Renner pull out a knife and jump at the adventurer. True, it isn't that rare, but just because it exists doesn't mean I have to accept it. You are mine, Arthur, and mine alone. I will share you with no one else. The princess said with finality in her tone. She was not going to share what belonged to her regardless of what the reason was. So if it meant ending her relationship with Lycius and possibly killing her, then so be it. Arthur was about to respond, however Lycius spoke first. While she was remorseful about the whole thing, that did not mean she had to stay silent. Arthur is not property you can own, Renner. He's a person and he can choose what he wants. He can't belong to anyone. Who are you to tell me what is mine doesn't belong to me? Not to mention the audacity to speak despite you being in the wrong. Renner said as she stood up, ignoring her aching parts, and Lycius separated herself from Arthur and inched forward. She winced a bit when Renner mentioned she was in the wrong, but she still stood her ground. You can't just say you own someone, he's not your slave. The adventurer responded. The tension in the room rose to greater heights, filling the room with its thick and stuffy feeling as the two women clashed. Arthur couldn't help but feel like he was overshadowed. Oh, of course, then since he's not a slave and a person who doesn't belong to anyone, that means he can choose, right? Renner spoke and both women looked at Arthur, who at this point was simply going to ensure that neither woman hurt the other, since it was obvious they weren't going to include him in the discussion, or rather he was conflicted on how to reconcile the situation without someone hitting someone else. What? He asked, seeing as they suddenly focused on him. Lycius believes you don't belong to me, so simply prove her wrong by choosing me over her. Renner stated, and Lycius felt a bit pensive. She hadn't meant for this to become a situation where Arthur was forced to choose, and she was fully aware that she would lose. She and Arthur had barely shared a kiss while he and Renner already had sex. I can choose both of you. There's no need for this to be such an issue. I believe I am man enough to love both of you equally, and if not equally then adequately enough that you're both happy. The man said, giving Lycius a bit of hope but causing Renner to frown. I will not share what is mine with someone else. Choose me, this isn't negotiable. The princess said with finality and unwilling to compromise. She had confidence that Arthur would choose her, as such it wasn't even a choice. Well, shit. Obviously he wasn't going to choose one over the other, so he simply needed to find a solution to the problem, and unfortunately he didn't have the time for it as he was being pressed for an answer right now. Hopefully this doesn't feel too rushed. Hope you enjoyed. Sorry for the delay. 9 comments 0 vote. Girl tears are powerful. The room became eerily silent as the tension permeated every corner of the space, suffocating everyone inside. This was especially palpable to Arthur. Arthur found himself being placed between a rock and a hard place. His gaze shifted to a less than pleased Renner that looked at him with a neutral expression as she awaited his response, but he knew she was far from calm. The princess was outwardly calm and poised. Despite her anger, she showed the grace and elegance one would expect out of her. Her ability to control and not show her emotions was something she prided herself in. She knew that outbursts were unbecoming of her. Lycius, on the other hand, felt an intense sense of guilt and anxiety. Not only has she ruined her friendship with Renner, but she knew well that Arthur would not choose her over Renner. His feelings for her probably weren't as potent as they were for the princess, and frankly, what did she have that Renner did not? This was a losing battle for her, and she knew it. In fact, Renner knew it. So rather than embarrass herself any further than she already has, she decided to speak, trying to end this charade. Although she couldn't help but feel a bit hurt, the man she liked didn't like her back. First of all, neither of you are property to be chosen, so there's nothing to choose, or rather, since you aren't property, I don't get to choose anything. Arthur cut her off before she could say anything, his voice cutting through the air but only serving to thicken the tension in the room. However, to Lycius his words brought a spark in her eyes, surprised her, and served to lighten her spirit and lift off the tension she felt on her shoulders. What? The princess questioned, anger implanting itself on her face as shown by the crease on her brows. This was not the outcome she expected. Secondly, I can choose the both of you if I have to. If you're giving me the choice, then I choose both of you. The man in the room spoke with finality in his tone, his words further lifting the tension off Lycius' shoulders but only creasing Renner's brows further. I'm not finished. Renner found her being cut off as the knight held up his hand and told her to speak no further. Thirdly, this is not the time for something like this. We're in the cusp of a civil war. Let us focus on that first before any interpersonal issues. He said and paused, waiting for either of them to respond but also congratulating himself for the quick thinking, although he figured that to avoid any drama in the future he will have to try and keep in his pants. I agree with you, Arthur. This isn't time for us to be thinking about ourselves, instead we should focus on the good of the kingdom. Lycius stated, trying her best not to sound happy about the fact that Arthur didn't choose Renner over her. She wasn't particularly good at hiding her emotions, but she made sure that her face remained neutral, denying the smile that wanted to form on her face. Any other day, Renner would have rolled her eyes at Lycius' words. She hadn't particularly appreciated the adventurer's goody two-shoes nature, but it's something she didn't hate. However, at this time her words felt nauseating. It also did help that the princess could see that the adventurer felt a little bit happy. Renner took a deep inhale then exhaled. Both of them were correct. Both her and Arthur's kingdom was waiting for them to take the throne, besides temper tantrums were unbecoming of her. I suppose both of you are correct. This will be revisited later. She relented and sat back down but gave Lycius a glare that made her anger clear. Seeing her calm down, Arthur felt relieved and let out a sigh. This was a good outcome, at least for the time being. Lycius is immune to poisons, right? He thought to himself. He does remember that one time in the anime when her team tried to subdue her and it took several attempts to weaken her enough for Evelyn's mind control to work. Great, Lycius, could you call Brain and your team over, please? I have an idea on how to end this charade once and for all. Arthur informed and Lycius gave him a nod before exiting the room, feeling relief as she did so. With the two now left alone together, silence permeated the room as they stared at each other. Renner had the urge to flip the table, but she knew she didn't have that kind of strength, so instead she asked him a question. I thought you said you loved me. Did I mishear those words? She asked, this time her words filled with a vulnerability that made Arthur feel a sense of guilt. Of course I love you, Renner, you didn't mishear anything. He said, his features softening as he approached her desk and held out his hand, especially asking her to stand up. Then why didn't you choose me? If you loved me you would have discarded Lycius without a second thought. She said, grabbing his hand and lifting herself up. Once she was standing, Arthur scooped her off her feet, sat down and placed her on his lap. She clung to his neck as they stared at each other's faces. Arthur gave her a chaste kiss before responding to her question. Renner, just because I love you doesn't mean I can't love other people too. She frowned at his words and he quickly tried to correct his statement. Think of it like this, a parent loves their children, does that mean they can only love one of their children whilst neglecting the other? Renner didn't respond and instead waited for him to continue. You were supposed to say no to that question, my dear. He said and once again gave her another kiss on her lips, and the princess could not help but find her anger fading away as she clung to his body, enjoying the moment. Romantic love can work like that as well. Just because I love you doesn't mean I can't love someone else too, and just because I love them doesn't mean I love you any less. He explained, running his fingers through her hair, and she hummed in satisfaction, enjoying his touch. That doesn't mean I have to accept this. You belong to me, Arthur. I won't let anyone other than me have you. She said, her tone less commanding despite her words being authoritative. Arthur couldn't help but sigh. It seemed that this will take a bit more convincing. Okay, think about this practically. Lycius is an adamantite adventurer. She has no obligation to stay in the kingdom. She's only helping right now because she sees this as her home. But that might not be the case in the future, so by having her at our side we ensure that she stays in the kingdom, permanently boosting our military might. He explained and she hummed, nodding in understanding. Arthur smiled and kissed her again. This time it was a deeper and more intimate kiss. They separated after a few seconds. I understand what you are saying, Arthur, but you aren't understanding what I'm saying, darling. She said, clasping his face and mushing it like it was clay. She kissed him again before she stared directly into his eyes, revealing her own obsession-filled pupils to him, and he felt a shiver run down his spine. You are mine and I will share you with no one. She said, her voice sweet and sultry to his ears, her eyes bored straight into his own as if she was staring down his soul. She revealed to him her deepest emotion, and Arthur found himself being turned on by such a display. Seems I'm going to have to put my foot down properly, can't have her thinking she's in control. He thought to himself, it was a good thing she didn't cry during this whole ordeal, otherwise he would have let her have whatever she wanted. Girl tears are a powerful thing. Interestingly enough, the more I write the more it feels like maybe I shouldn't end this so fast, so I was thinking of a more temporary ending. I don't know, I'm very wishy-washy on this and my emotions on it fluctuate irregularly. Sometimes I'm sick of it and just want to drop it, and sometimes I like it and want to continue. It's very weird. 5 comments 0 vote. Interrupting a meeting. The citizens of Yggdrassil found themselves locked into their homes as their streets were filled with armored men, standing on every corner of every street and building. All city activities were halted for the day as both armies from the old king's faction and the new king's faction filled the streets of Yggdrassil, each knight sporting a stoic expression as the political leaders of their respective sides were currently engaged in a meeting. The building both leaders were in was surrounded by knights that were armed to the teeth and wearing the highest quality armor both sides could afford. The building was a mansion that belonged to the mayor of the city, and it was decently large enough to fit at least 100 knights within its walls and still have room to spare. Inside one of the smaller rooms, one guarded by 10 knights from each side of the door, it was where the leaders were seated and engaged in a civil discussion. I thank you for agreeing to this meeting, Barbro. I know you must loathe leaving the throne. The king addressed his son. His face was stern and showed no outward emotions, however he felt troubled deep down. Perhaps if had he focused more on Barbro's education as a prince this wouldn't have happened, or perhaps being a more present father would have reined in his son's impulsive actions a lot earlier. Of course, father. You deserve at least this much courtesy. Barbro answered, slightly surprising Marquis Bulup that stood beside him. Of course the king was Barbro's father and in a way the prince still held respect for him, so he wouldn't go out of his way to be rude. Thank you nonetheless. I'm sure you're aware of why we pushed for this meeting and I'd rather we not dance around the issue when the lives of the citizens are at stake. King Ramposa informed and the prince simply snorted at his father's words. He held a small semblance of respect for the king but not complete respect. There was a difference. We are the royalty here, father. Everyone in this kingdom is beneath us. What value is there in considering their opinion? The prince responded to his father's words, and the king sighed as he once again witnessed his own failure as a father. Barbro had the wrong ideas of what royalty was, and as his father, the king should have corrected those ideas long ago. We aren't here to discuss any of that, my son. I've come to you with a proposal and I do hope you'll accept it. As the king said all that, Margrave Eurovana and the young Marquis Pespi shared a look, then they looked at Marquis Bulup who only glanced at them before refocusing on the two leaders. If it has nothing to do with your surrender, father, then I do not want to hear it. The new king relaxed on his chair, his arms folding, a clear display of his unflinching position. It was a silent gesture that told all in the room that he will not be compromising on his position. Be reasonable, Barbro. You know this isn't the way things are done. Even if I give you the throne, the peasants will not be satisfied and they may riot. If that comes to pass, then we have a royal army for a reason. Being beholden to the whims of the commoners is beneath people of high station like us. The former prince countered and the king heaved another sigh. He fought the urge to massage his temples. Barbro, listen. It's the very masses that allow us to be royalty, regardless if we own the land or not. When the masses rebel, entire royal lines can be ended in an afternoon. The king explained, trying to get across the idea that royalty is only royalty because the commoners allow them to be, but once again Barbro snorted at his father's words, unconvinced of them or rather completely unwilling to accept them as true. Only weak kings fall to the masses. A sufficient and loyal army is enough to crush any rebellion. Once again Barbro countered and the king felt arguing would be futile. He wondered if he got the stubbornness from his mother. She was certainly an unflinching woman. Perhaps if she was still here she would have managed to convince him. Your Highness, let us at least hear His Majesty's proposal. Bulup spoke for the first time in this meeting and Barbro pursed his lips in contemplation before nodding and became willing to listen. The king was quick to notice this and he realized two things. The first being Bulup had some control over Barbro and was possibly the one in control, and the second was that he had failed as a father so much so that his son would first listen to another man than his own father. The proposal I offer to you, my son, is that I will give you the throne, however I shall follow due procedure to do it. Barbro hummed and looked at his father. His words were clearly a trap. There's no way that the Margrave and the Marquis from the royalty faction would let that happen. The prince waited for his father to explain. The idea is you let me take back the throne and I will give it back to in 3 years, this way we. No. Barbro flatly answered, cutting his father off. He no longer needed to hear such nonsense. Why would he give up the throne when he already has it? The only thing he needs now is just the legitimacy of the 6 great nobles. With the 6 on his side he can legitimize his rule. Son under. The king was cut off again. However, this time it was not Barbro who cut him off. Instead, everyone and everything in the room was halted to a stop. It wasn't just the people in the room either, but everything outside, even further beyond the kingdom of Riestais. Everything in the world had frozen to halt. Time had been slowed down so much that it appeared to not be moving at all. Aside from the person who stopped it and only one other person in the Elf Kingdom, no one in the entire world was moving. Everything was stopped. This is always weird to observe. Arthur said as he entered the room and placed Renner on a nearby empty chair before closing the door. I've already placed Lachias and the others in their proper positions. He remembered before he allowed the time to move again, and slowly everything began to move again. The world returned to its natural state once more. Stand. This is for the betterment of the kingdom. You may not believe what I said, but the commoners are a fearsome force when provoked. The king continued to speak as if he was never interrupted or stopped, and once again Barbro remained unconvinced, going so far as to roll his eyes as his father's words. Seems you guys are in the middle of something. Everyone jumped off their chairs in sudden shock. They stood up as they heard a familiar voice. They quickly turned their heads towards it and saw Arthur. He was standing beside a calm and poised Renner with a gentle smile on her face. The two conveyed an image of a knight and his fair lady beside each other. Before they could speak, there was a sudden noise outside the room, multiple sounds of bodies hitting the floor and the sounds of swords clashing, before the door was opened revealing Lycius. Took care of the guards outside the room, only Gazef is putting up a resistance after we're done with him, we'll be dealing with the knights, downstairs. She said all that before quickly closing the door and joined Gagaron in her battle with the chief warrior. I'm sure you're wondering how we got in here. Renner quickly beat them to the question. Their shocked faces looked quite amusing, especially the look of fear plastered on Balup's face. The man looked like he just saw death. But you don't need to know that. 12 comments 0 vote. Was she always like this? Swords clashed and sparks flew in the air continuously as the two swordsmen clashed within the closed space of a corridor. Gazef Stranov, chief warrior of the Re-Esti's kingdom, found himself being pushed back as Brain Unglass pushed the offensive, pressing on the attack with an overhead sword strike. The blades collided, sparks flew in the air as Gazef parried the attack and moved back. Brain pushed further, going for an upward swing, however Gazef was quick to dodge by stepping to the side, evading getting his arm chopped off. Having successfully evaded the attack, the chief warrior responded with his own overhead downward swing, but Brain quickly jumped back. However, the attack sliced open his shirt, but he hardly paid that any mind. This time Gazef pressed forward, going for a straight thrust, cutting through the thick air filled with tension and hoping to pierce through Brain's chest, however the attack was dodged as Unglass slid to the side. The blue-haired warrior then used his own sword to hit Gazef's sword upward, opening the defenses of his opponent. He quickly capitalized by doing a one-hand forward thrust. Gazef dodged, but the blade cut open his chest plate. Gazef's dodge had too much power behind it, as such his back hit the wall, which Brain quickly took advantage of, but Gazef dropped into a squat, letting the blade cut off barely a centimeter of his hair. Just as he was about to counter-attack, Brain quickly jumped back, opening the distance between the two of them, and this gave them both time to take a small break. Always keeping me in my toes, Brain. Gazef complimented, and Brain simply snorted and smiled before responding. I wouldn't be your equal if I couldn't keep you on your toes, now could I? The blue-haired man said, his tone amused, as his blade pointed at his opponent. There was zero animosity between the two, they were simply fighting because they were on opposing sides. Gazef wanted to get past Brain and reach the king, and Brain was preventing him from doing that. Despite his full attention being on his opponent, Brain was still a bit surprised by the amount of power Arthur wielded. He doesn't know what the man did, but Brain was in a room filled with the rest of Blue Rose, then the next moment, boom, he's here. He was sure even teleportation gave a warning before activation, but whatever Arthur did was spontaneous and inexplicable. Not to mention, the leader of Blue Rose left him to deal with Gazef. Of course that's what he wanted, he just didn't like how they assumed he'd be facing Gazef, like he was somehow destined to do so. I suppose, but both of us are still far from reaching his level, yet. Gazef responded with a smile on his face. They were in a corridor, which meant as swordmen both were being handicapped. It was essentially a fair playing field, but Gazef had an advantage over Brain. I don't think we'll ever reach his level. He's human, isn't he? And we're human too, it should be possible. Brain withheld a laugh, choosing not to insult his friend, but Brain knew full well that Arthur was in a league of his own and he was an exception, the only human who'll ever reach that level of power. I admire your optimism, Gazef, but Arthur's level is unreachable, not by us normal humans. Gazef wanted to disagree, however. Brain wasn't speaking like he was giving up, he didn't feel the pessimistic tone like he did before. So you're going to give up? No, not yet, I'm just acknowledging that there's a level of power I would never reach, but that doesn't mean I can't try to get as strong as I can. Brain explained, and Gazef hummed, nodding to his words, although he still believed that Arthur wasn't that out of reach, but he could see where Brain was coming from. Well, enough about Arthur, let's finally settle who's the stronger between the two us. Brain nodded, and their battle once again resumed, this time at a greater intensity. Renner made herself comfortable atop her lover's lap, with his arms around her waist and chin resting on her shoulder. His breath felt ticklish on her neck. How did you get in here? Barbro repeated the question and forcing Renner into having to repeat herself. As I've said, you don't need to know that, but don't worry, we won't harm you, we just want to negotiate something as well. The princess informed as she felt Arthur smell her hair, something she didn't particularly hate but wished he'd do in private, although she didn't stop him. Negotiate what? You don't have anything to negotiate with. Barbro responded, his brows creased in a bit of frustration. What's with people wanting to take his throne away from him? Plus now that there's another party involved, his assassin may need to hold off attacking. Oh, we have plenty to negotiate with. The citizens may be happy to have my father on the throne, but that's only because they'd be happy to get rid of you, not because they actually prefer father as king. She said, and both the king and Barbro frowned. The king frowned more in sadness than anything else. He knew he was a mediocre king at best, but he didn't like hearing that out loud. Why do you all keep mentioning the peasants as if they hold any power over people like us? They're peasants, they are supposed to obey us, not the other way around. Renner's melodious laugh echoed as it filled the room, completely replacing the tension that had been present. Of course Barbro found nothing funny about what he said, so his frown deepened. What's so amusing, UW? Watch yourself, guy. Referring to her with anything other than her name will have consequences. Arthur cut off the young prince, and caused the marquis that stood behind him to tense up, and beads of sweat trickled down his head. It was a miracle the marquis hadn't died of a heart attack yet. I am the king of this country and I will speak any way I wish. Barbro stated, his voice booming as he said so. He was not about to let himself be threatened, especially not by a no-name commoner. He was king. Go ahead then, speak your mind. And with those words the heavy tension was quick to return. Marquis Bulup grasped the prince's shoulder in an attempt to have him calm down or at least watch his words. My king, I. Barbro slapped the hand aside and stared at Arthur with an intense glare. You think I'll be afraid of you just because you threatened me with violence? Am I supposed to just cower in fear because you have power? I'm not afraid of you and I'm not going to hold my tongue. A king does no such thing. Barbro expressed to the stone-faced Arthur, who held Renner gently, his hands feeling her flat stomach and resisting the urge to move up and fondle her breasts. You have free speech, guy. You can say whatever you feel like, so go ahead, refer to Renner however you wish. After those words, the room descended into an uneasy silence, Arthur's words hanging over their heads like a guillotine and allowed the tension to thicken further. Who do you think you are? You are nothing but a barbarian, who can only use violence to get what he wants. You are a commoner, a peasant with not a shred of history or lineage. Compared to an heir of royalty with history that dates back to the founding of this kingdom like me, you are nothing but horse dung wishing it were diamond. The prince ranted in fury. He was not about to be made a coward by someone below him in station regardless of the power they had. He was a king and he'll be damned before he threw away his pride. Arthur on the other hand was not even paying him attention as he held Renner close and lifted his hand up to grab something, only for Renner to slap it back down. Humph, I knew you weren't going to do nothing, even you can't kill a king like myself so easily. Barbro caught his own head and his eyes going wide in shock as his body fell back with a thud and his blood spraying the walls. Everyone remained still and silence graced the room again, however it only stayed for a few seconds, being sent out by the king, who staggered back in shock and his back making contact with the wall, wide-eyed and displaying his disbelief. Both Marquis Pespi and Margrave Eurovana quickly stifled their own shock and tried to have him steady himself so he doesn't do something foolish. Bulup on the other hand passed out while standing up. He was already a bundle of fear the moment Arthur appeared in the room. A person who believes their birth grants them specific privileges and command over others never turns out as a good person. I'm not a judge of justice and what I did is far from just, but it is quite unfortunate that might make right in this world. Well, unfortunate for the weak. Arthur explained as he was once again reminded of Iskander. Although this was an act of cruelty, he felt less bad about it. Oh well, I suppose we didn't need him for the negotiations anyway. Father, collect yourself and let's speak. Renner said after a single clap of her hand, already moving on from the issue, and it was here that her and his entourage realized something about Renner, and it was a realization that changed the image they had of her. Was she always like this? I'm currently writing 2 fanfics that are unposted. A My Hero Academia with a Viltrumat and Izuku who's a hero killer apprentice of Stain. And Dragon Ball with the Mech having reincarnated as Brawly, but in a where Universe 6 and 7 fused and now the U7 Scions are at war with U6 Scions. What do you guys want to see? Just click on the paragraph and say +1 to whichever of the 2 you like more. 10 comments 0 vote. A win is a win. The room was eerily silent as everyone stood still, their attention locked on the smiling face of the princess. The 3 individuals who looked at her found themselves having chills run all over their bodies. They were unaware of her ruthlessness till now. Her callous disregard for her own brother's life alerted them and made their hairs stand. It wasn't something they would have expected from the Golden Princess. The silence continued, drowning in the room in an unpleasant feeling until the unconscious body of Marquis Bullock hit the ground with a thud, marking an end to the silence and allowing Renner to speak once more. Now then, father. I believe it is obvious what Arthur and I wish to negotiate. She said. Her voice was calm and eerily melodic to the ears of both Margrave Eurovana and Marquis Pespi. It was an odd mixture of naturally pleasant and sinister due to the fact she barely looks affected by the fact her brother just died. The king, on the other hand, found himself at a loss for words. His son was just killed and he couldn't properly process what happened. One moment Barbara was fine and the next his head was in his hands. Not only that, but his own daughter cared less, as if he was a stranger that had no relation to neither him nor Barbara. This left him unable to speak for several moments. He didn't know how to feel or what to feel, so instead he just stood there stunned and completely unresponsive. He was wide awake and could hear what was being said, he just couldn't respond at the moment. Your Highness, I'm sure you know that tradition dictates that a man be king, and Baron Arthur is a foreigner not born on this land. Margrave spoke in the king's stead. Although he felt his own hands tremble just slightly, he didn't see it, but he knew it was Arthur that killed Barbara. As such, he was fully aware that everyone in this room was at the mercy of Arthur. The man possessed a deadly swiftness and speed. He killed Barbara faster than a blink of an eye. No one in the room even saw his attack, and Barbara just died. Tradition. Is that what you really want to use as a reason to deny us the throne? Arthur asked, his arms still holding Renner, who seemed to be very comfortable on his lap, as she made no attempt to stand up, although she did have to slap his hands to keep them where they were. Margrave, I do hope you are aware that I have Arthur, the man who wiped out a whole army by himself. If you want this to get violent, just say so. She said calmly, and Margrave felt like taking a step back. Her words made him tremble and sweat. She also made him realize that any war with Arthur would just be a slaughter. If you aren't convinced, then let me say this: for the longest time my father has been more concerned with placating the nobles, making them happy, in the interests of preventing a civil war. Of course, His Majesty's duty is to ensure the kingdom stays afloat and doesn't fall. Civil wars only cause destruction. Margrave Eurovana said without hesitation, fully believing that there was nothing wrong with ensuring the country remained stable and standing. True, but that was at the expense of the commoners. For all my father's words about ensuring the commoners are happy, he certainly didn't do anything to make them happy. If I hadn't proposed the abolishment of slavery, he would have never made that into law and would have opted to keep the nobles happy. The Margrave was about to respond, but he was quick to realize he had no response. Much of the pushback against the abolishment of slavery was more about nobles being able to make profit with free labor and near zero expenses. Not only that, but there was also the issue of 8 fingers. It took Arthur, a foreigner as you say, to finally destroy them. An organization that was eating away at the country, but no one would do anything because the nobles prevented anyone from doing anything. She explained, and the Margrave could only stand there in silence. He knew it was also about maintaining the balance of power, even if it meant letting the nobles work with literal criminals. The kingdom has been very slowly being whittled away, and eventually, it would have been destroyed or taken over. I do not hold much love for people, but I, for one, would not like to see my home reduced to such a state. She closed and paused, letting her words sink into the room, allowing everyone in the room to process them before speaking again. So I say, let us have the throne, and gracefully give it up. The people will thank you for it. When she finished, Margrave could only stand in silence. He had his own thoughts that he wanted to voice, but this time, it was not his place to speak anymore. One can only do so much on behalf of another. The silence prevailed for a full minute before the king spoke again. He had managed to push aside the issues plaguing his mind and decided to address the issue at hand. Renner is right. He admitted, feeling the bitterness of having to admit his own failings. He also couldn't help but feel the foreignness of him speaking her name. He couldn't tell why that was at the moment, but he knew it was odd. I spent too much time trying to maintain the kingdom that I did not think of improving it, and because of that I let the nobles get away with things they shouldn't have. I am a failure as a king. Both Paisia and Eurovana were quick to try and disagree. However, the king held up his hand, cutting them off before they could even get a word in. There is no point in trying to deny what is true. I thought I was doing what was best, but I was misguided. A kingdom is not supposed to stagnate but improve with each ruler that sits on the throne, and I have failed at that. He explained, and nobody in the room disagreed with him. Although Arthur wanted to add the fact that King Ramposa III lacked the qualities of a king to begin with, however Arthur himself had yet to be king, as such he had no room to talk. Very well, my daughter, I will hand the throne to the both of you. I can only hope you will do better than me. Excellent, father. Don't worry about Nazzarick. I'm sure he will have no problem with your decision. She said. She predicted a while ago that Nazzarick would probably no longer want the throne once he knew of Arthur's true power. Although she has yet to know if that's true or not, she is confident in her deduction. Although she did hope that he is negotiating something good for the kingdom from the empire. Now that's over, let's stop the fighting outside and announce the news. A new day for the Re-Estais kingdom has begun. Arthur said with a grin as he gently removed Renner from his lap and stood up. Although he had wanted this whole ordeal to be much more epic than it was, but what can one do? A win is a win. Sorry about the late chapter, I have no excuses. 9 comments 0 vote. Elf King equivalent. 2 days ago. Slain theocracy. Zeshi Zetsume had triumphantly returned from her mission. She had walked through the halls of the main cathedral humming a smooth melody, one that her mother used to sing to her after a hard day's work of intense training. For the most part, she only had to report her success to one of the cardinals, and that was Cardinal Raymond. However, she was feeling a bit more defiant, so she strolled right into their meeting hall, let herself in, interrupted their meeting, and reported her success with a laissez-faire attitude. Having heard her report, the cardinals were pleased with her work. She had expected them to reward her with something, even though the mission had no reward attached to it. Antline, for the most part, is sheltered, not in the sense that she doesn't know how the world works, but more in the sense that her power and skill were too great to simply let her roam free as she pleased. As such, she was often tasked with guarding the treasury of the slain theocracy. The only other time she could leave was when she had a task or was needed on the battlefield against the elves. Due to this, the girl had a longing to go outside and spend her time doing something other than fighting or completing a mission. She was also keenly aware that the other reason why she was never let outside was the fact that she wasn't a slave when all other elves were slaves, meaning that she couldn't be seen without a slave collar on. She also knew that most of the cardinals did not like the fact she was an elf. This was also why, even when on the battlefield, she often acted alone, as most, if not the whole army, seemed to avoid her or think less of her, even though they wouldn't vocalize their thoughts to her. Despite all that, she felt like she deserved to leisurely spend time out regardless of what anyone thought. After all, she has served her country well enough to deserve it. Perhaps it was unreasonable for her to expect a reward when one wasn't stipulated, but you can understand the reasons she frowned when all she got was good work from one of the cardinals before they then discussed what to do next. We will forgive the transgressions of interrupting our meeting, so you are dismissed. It was Cardinal Raymond who had said, and Zeshi had slumped her shoulders in response. Of course, she planned to reward herself by doing what she wanted anyway. She was just a bit disappointed that they just didn't give the permission. However, before Zeshi could have the chance to exit the room, someone else burst into the room and announced the death of 2 members of the Black Scripture, a revelation Antline did not appreciate. Liar. Antline accused, and the resident need of the scripture, astrologer. She flinched in slight fear as she saw the fire in Zeshi's eyes. The extra seed of the Black Scripture did not appreciate the implications of having failed her mission. I killed that man, using the weapon that was once wielded by one of the 6 great gods. Are you saying a weapon that belonged to the god of death failed to kill an enemy? She expressed, believing her fellow members of the Black Scripture to be mistaken, and the cardinals could only look at her and agree. They in no way were going to ignore the report, especially coming from a Black Scripture member and above all one coming from astrologer. However, Zeshi was correct, the scythe of the death god could kill anyone and anything. I assure you, Master Zeshi, I am not lying. Thousand League astrologer gave a bow towards Zeshi as if to apologize as she rummaged through her bag and pulled out 4 crystals, or rather, it had been 2 crystals that were both split in 2 and were now 4. Impossible. That's absurd. The cardinals voiced in surprise and shock. Each member of the Black Scripture had a crystal that represented their life. As long as they were alive, the crystal would glow bright, like a light bulb. When they die, the light fades, informing everyone of their death. However, if the crystal is split in two, that means the dead scripture member is dead and cannot be revived. Antline, you reported that you left 2 scripture members to guard the body. Who were they? One-man army and strongest human. Zeshi answered with a neutral and expressionless face. However, inwardly, she felt a mixture of emotions. So he survived. She thought she didn't know what to feel. On the one hand, it meant he was strong enough for her to possibly go all out and test if he was stronger than her, meaning she might have found the perfect match to create an offspring that would kill her father. However, on the other hand, she has failed her mission. Up until now, she has had a 100% mission success rate, sharing the record with the captain of the scripture, and since she failed, it was imperative to correct her mistake. It's fine, I can go after him again. I underestimated him and didn't go all out, but now that we know, I will make sure to kill him for real. She suggested. No. The fact he killed 2 members of the scripture means he's a threat level equivalent to the Elf King. The Cardinal of Fire, Berenice, explained, and the others gave her a nod. In the past, only the Elf King had the necessary power to kill or capture members of the Black Scripture. As such, this new enemy needed to be treated with the same level of caution. We will plan for him and create countermeasures. For the time being, you will be under lockdown. This failure will not be overlooked. Maximilian, the Cardinal of Darkness, expressed and told Zeshi, who for some reason did not protest being put under lockdown. Both of you are dismissed. We have much to discuss. Raymond, the Cardinal of Earth, commanded, and both astrologer and Zeshi exited the room. Although unbeknownst to them, the elf had her own plans. The door closed, and the cardinals began to discuss their next move. Do we declare war on the Re-Estais kingdom? Yvonne, the Cardinal of Light asked as she swept her gaze across the room. In truth, this Arthur Pendragon had been something they thought would be dealt with and then forgotten. Their confidence in Zeshi was absolute or had been absolute, but it seemed that Arthur was more of a threat than they realized. No, we waging war on 2 fronts is ill-advised. It might make the Elf King bold and attack us directly. We can't risk that. Raymond objected. Even if the Re-Estais kingdom was a disappointment, it was still too risky to wage war while the Elf King and his forces were yet to be dealt with. Indeed, however, I propose we send envoys to Re-Estais and inform their king that this Arthur Pendragon is in cahoots with the Elf King who wants to enslave us, humans. Dominic, the Cardinal of Wind suggested. He thought it best to poison the well and sow distrust between Arthur and the Re-Estais crown. The slain theocracy has had amazing PR amongst a majority of the human kingdoms, and it is commonly believed that they have the interest of humanity and that their war with the elves is to defeat the Elf King who wants to enslave humans. That's a plausible idea. It would coincidence with how he suddenly showed up and has zero background or history. Zinedine, the Cardinal of Water, agreed and received some nods from a few of his peers. Not only that, if they chose to ignore us, we can send the same message to the Empire and other kingdoms, informing them the Re-Estais supports the idea of human enslavement. Berenice added, and more of the cardinals began to nod, agreeing to such a suggestion. It helped that nations like the Dragon Kingdom and the Holy Roble Kingdom were dependent on the support of the slain theocracy. Are we all in agreement then? Raymond asked, and everyone in the room nodded. Very well, we'll iron out the details next, but that's the plan going forward. Sorry, forgot to update. 3 comments, 0 vote. Talking to a friend. The sun peeked through the window as its orange glow slowly began to fade, little by little, alerting the people, or rather, the person inside that night was slowly settling in. Zeshi sat on the cold, hard marble floor using the double door that led into the treasury to support her back. A small ball bounced back and forth between her delicate-looking but deceptively strong hand and the wall. Not yet. She reminded herself, making sure that she wasn't hasty in her actions. The sun was just barely setting. She needed to wait at least until a few hours after dark to take action, so for now, she had to endure the boredom. Spending a week guarding the slain theocracy treasury was not the most exciting job, but it was the one she was most familiar with. They won't let me roam the streets, yet they trust me to guard their treasury. Zeshi questioned. It was certainly an odd way of treating someone, but it was obvious to her long ago that they saw her as more of a weapon than a person. You don't trust a person to guard your treasure, but instead, you trust a weapon. After all, a weapon won't steal from you. She concluded. In terms of how she felt about that, she didn't know, she certainly was powerful, so they weren't wrong to treat her like the weapon she was capable of being. She let out a sigh before she suddenly felt a presence coming her way. It was the same person who always seemed to visit her the moment she was bored. He was the only person who bothered to talk to her outside of work. Don't you have a harem to impregnate? Why come here? She asked sarcastically as the captain of the Black Scripture arrived before her. I'm already done with that. I'm afraid, so I've got nothing but time. He answered. As one of the very few godkin that are known to exist, the captain of the Black is required to ensure that more of his kind are born. Of course, regardless of who he impregnates, it is never guaranteed they'll be able to awaken as godkin. The theocracy, however, is hopeful that at least one of his children will awaken, and that's enough for the cardinals to order him to sleep with as many women as possible. So what? Do you want me to entertain you or something? Nothing of the sort. I thought you might want to hear some news. After all, you've been stuck in here for a week. He reasoned, and Zeshi didn't respond, but silently motioned for him to go on and tell her. Well, the first bit of news is that the man you were supposed to kill has now been crowned as the new ruler of the Re-Esti's kingdom, him and the princess. He informed her, and she raised a curious brow and stopped throwing the small ball at the wall. She certainly didn't expect that. Maybe attacking Arthur out of nowhere will be a bit more complicated now. Did he take over? No, he apparently put a stop to the civil war and was crowned soon after. I'm fairly certain he strong-armed or threatened the previous king, at least that's the narrative the cardinals are taking. He informed before walking to the other wall and settling down to face her way, and they began tossing the ball at each other. Obviously, someone comparable to the Elf King in strength is now also ruling a kingdom. I imagine they aren't too happy with that one. She said the cardinals, or rather them and the pontifex, had a thing about controlling power. They wanted it for their own benefits and feared it when it wasn't under their control. They also had a thing for thinking they somehow represented humanity and thus were responsible for it. Quite. In fact, I believe at least 4 members of the Black Scripture will be sent to the Holy Roble Kingdom and the Dragon Kingdom respectively, to help both kingdoms from the Beastman threat, but it's obviously a way to gain their support when they declare Re-Esti as an enemy of humanity. The captain explained, and Zeshi couldn't help but snort in amusement. They really were doing everything to ensure they had the upper hand. Seems to me that they're throwing a tantrum for not getting what they wanted. Careful now, that just might be blasphemous. Please, like I care, I'm certain the 6 would forgive me. She said dismissively. Zeshi did not particularly care about the theocracy itself. There was a time when she did, but that was a long time ago. She knew now that the very nation she was in service of didn't love her, and if she were to die, they wouldn't even mourn her. She was fine with that. She understood that her own genetics as a half-elf made her a lesser in their eyes, and she didn't particularly disagree with that either. It's not like being half-elf has done her much good. Her only goal at present was killing the Elf King and getting her revenge by all means necessary. Her service to the theocracy was to achieve that end. At least, they were the ones with the best chance of helping her achieve her goal, or rather, they were the best chance, but not anymore. Some would say she's ungrateful, but they've hardly given her anything to be grateful for. I know you're planning to break your house arrest. The captain suddenly informed and caused the half-elf to scowl just slightly. And you think you can stop me? I was thinking maybe I can convince you otherwise. Don't bother, unless you want me to be annoyed. The captain simply shrugged and decided to heed her words. He figured he had no right to tell her otherwise about her goal. Fair enough. He said before once again standing and bidding her farewell, leaving the half-elf to her devices. He did consider her to be a sort of a friend, but he supposed she didn't think the same. Alright, next chapter we will back to Arthur. I just wanted to give Zeshi a bit more, I guess, characterization before her battle with Arthur. 8 comments 0 vote. New king, new queen. The throne room was packed with all the nobles of the kingdom. All of them were present regardless of rank and position. This included people who were chiefs of villages and city mayors. This was a significant event that required all people who were relevant to the kingdom's life's blood to be present, and declining to be here would be a treasonous act. The morning's rising sun peered through the windows, illuminating the room with a warm golden glow that signaled a new beginning for the kingdom of Ainz and its people. All these individual nobles and people were kneeling on one knee and had their heads down looking at the floor. There was a pensive and tense atmosphere in the room. Of course, this wasn't because of any underlying tension or conflict between the nobles and the new rulers. It was simply because new rulers had been crowned. With the crowning of this new king and queen came a lot of changes, the first one being that the position of the queen was no longer just a decorative position meant for the woman to look good. The queen now held sway within the noble court. The 6 great nobles were forced to accept this, regardless of their protests, although the former king had no qualms with the decision as it meant a foreigner like Arthur wouldn't have complete rule over the kingdom. This was just one of the few changes that were to come, and a majority of the nobles present knew more changes would come and they would affect their livelihoods. That brought a sense of anxiety and unease to them as it brought the possibility of some of them losing their positions. All hail the new king and queen of the Ainz kingdom. Gazefstranov shouted, his voice echoing throughout the whole room as he stood next to the new Queen Renner. All hail. Everyone shouted in unison as they lifted their heads and looked at their new rulers, acknowledging them and accepting their rule. Of course, there were those who did not accept the new rulers and instead remained silent and did not acknowledge them. Renner's face displayed a small gentle smile as she witnessed this take place. Her face may have been smiling but her mind was calculating. She was already aware that there would be those who may oppose hers and Arthur's rule, especially considering that her brother Xanac was alive. As such, she is currently thinking of ways to curb any would-be rebels. It wasn't just that, but new ideas about how to run the kingdom came to her mind rapidly, who to keep and who to discard. A complete structural change was not possible, and the corruption ran deep, but she was ready to tweak and straighten out all the necessary parts. Of course, she didn't forget her promise to Lycias's father and planned to give the man what he asked for. Arthur, on the other hand, displayed a wide grin, baring his teeth in silent satisfaction. He was now a king, a title that came with a plethora of responsibilities but also one that came with the freedom of knowing that no one can command him and only he commands. Of course, he doesn't plan to be the type that rules with an iron fist. Iskander's speech was still fresh and present in his mind. He didn't know if that type of kind was going to be a successful king, but he was determined to try it out. If it later turns out to be unfeasible, then he can abandon it and try a different philosophy. He was also keenly aware that he now had a massive responsibility on his shoulders and one that made it so he could not afford to mess up or people's livelihoods were at risk. This is what highlighted the fact he knew nothing about running a country and he would need to learn on the job. How hard could it be? He thought, I mean, if some of the most incompetent people in the world could become president back in his world, then surely a person of average intelligence like himself can do somewhat of a good job. Plus, with Renner's help, it shouldn't be that difficult. Rise, my subjects. Renner's voice took him out of his thoughts and he prepared to speak, as he saw everyone in the room slowly get to their feet. Both Arthur and Renner stood up from their respective thrones and held hands before Arthur addressed his audience. His face was stern and conveyed a look and air that a king should have when addressing his audience. The sunlight struck his face and hair, highlighting his handsome features. As the newly appointed rulers of the Ainz kingdom, we vow to bring prosperity and peace to the lives of all who live within its borders. We vow to rule fairly and just. We vow to give opportunity and/or punishment to those who deserve it. So we ask that you support us in creating a prosperous and long-lasting kingdom. With that having been said, both rulers took a small bow, humbly giving thanks to the crowd for allowing this opportunity for new rulers. Long live the king. Long live the queen. Long live the Ainz kingdom. The crowd cheered loudly and clearly, which was then followed by a cacophony of clapping that drowned out any other sounds and, with it, marked the ending to the ceremony, and the guest could now leave. Of course, not everyone was happy about the new rulers. Marquis Bulup was pensive and tense, and his hands were stiff as he clapped. Arthur, however, was not focused on such trivial matters, mostly because his mind was occupied by something else entirely. You see, the issue concerning Renner and Lycias had yet to be resolved and he hadn't had the chance to convince the new queen to allow Lycias to be his second lover, and at present everything was undetermined. After this was done, Arthur was unsure whether or not to bring the topic back up again. It was a delicate matter that needed to be handled with care. His first attempt was sloppy and was done hastily. He acted out of impulse, thinking it wouldn't be too difficult to convince Renner, but he was wrong, and it also ended with him committing hypocrisy. His second attempt needs to be more planned, so he wanted to let the issue settle for a bit before trying again. Jesus fucking Christ, this is what I get for being greedy. He chastised himself. Truly, a single woman should be more than enough. Why must he want two when one would suffice? The new king sighed to himself. Well, one thing was for sure. He got what he wanted, and he had no right to complain. If you can and are able, please support me on Patreon and get early access to the MHA fanfic I've been working on. Only 5 chapters out yet. 6 comments, 0 vote.